welcome back to this week's video, and in this video the topic will be the writings of one really cool woman that I absolutely admire, and her name is Susan Sontag. She was an American writer during the 20th century who was best known for her critical essays dealing with topics that go all the way from like arts and literature to like culture and politics. Some of her most famous works include Against Interpretation, Styles of Radical Will, On Photography, and much more. So this video will be mainly focused on her really famous essay Against Interpretation and some other works included in this collection of her essays. Let's start with the very first and most seminal essay Against Interpretation. So to sum up the argument of this essay, I would give you this quote. "In place of hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art." Basically, she is arguing against the contemporary paradigm of attempting to excessively interpret hidden meanings in art. In particular, she's citing literature and paintings as examples. To begin with, she first gives an account of why we have started to look beyond the literal meaning of literary works. In the beginning, from like the mimetic theory of the classical world from the Greeks, art is usually assumed to be representation or mimesis, and then what happened was that interpretation first appears in the culture of late classical antiquity, when the power and credibility of myth had been broken by the realistic view of the world introduced by scientific enlightenment. And then following this problem, what happens is that interpretation kicks in. So interpretation thus presupposes a discrepancy between the clear meaning of the text and the demands of later readers. It seeks to resolve that discrepancy. The situation is that for some reason a text has become unacceptable, yet it cannot be discarded. Interpretation is a radical strategy for conserving an old text, which is thought too precious to repudiate by revamping it. The interpreter, without actually erasing or rewriting the text, is altering it. But he can't commit to doing this. He claims to be only making it intelligible by disclosing its true meaning. However far the interpreters alter the text, they must claim to be reading off a sense that is already there. So Sontag argues that modern acts of interpretation, they're really marked by an overt contempt for appearances. So why is that? Because the critics seem never satisfied with whatever that is just plainly there in the work, but they're always seeking for more. So the question now becomes, are we really enjoying the text itself, like what we can straight away gain from the text itself, or are we tyrannically imposing our own wills upon it? So it's kind of like akin to the act of distorting the testimonies of like suspected political dissidents in order to frame them of some sort of political crime. So given such climate of the dominant literary criticism, then in around like the mid to late 20th century, we increasingly find works that are written with the purpose of being interpreted. Works stuff themselves with a bunch of like complex allusions, symbolism, metaphors, and they never like straightforwardly just tell us what it wants to say, so it becomes increasingly inaccessible to like the common non-academic reader. And Sontag is questioning, is this what we really want? In response to this climate, obviously there are people who disagree and they want to change it. So Sontag says, to avoid interpretation, art may become parody, or it may become abstract, or it may become decorative, or it may become non-art. So here she uses examples such as abstract paintings, where there's like no content, pop art that just really blasts all there is to be said in your face, and also French poetry that's along the school of symbolism, and these are all attempts to escape interpretation. Ultimately, she advocates that we should really, let's say, return to our senses in a sense. So we need to access what actually is there and contemplate upon the work of art in itself rather than trying to overinterpret it. However, there are some questions and challenges I wish to raise to her thesis. So firstly, it's difficult to draw a line between just appropriate interpretation and over-interpretation, and obviously it's too extreme to say that we shouldn't try to like look beyond the surface in any single work. And certain authors, for example, they do intend some of their symbolisms to convey something. The use of symbolism itself either like achieves a sort of artistic effect, evoke a sort of aesthetic response, or it's set up to avoid upsetting certain like literary senses, so we should not discard interpretation altogether. Sontag disdains the idea that we are assuming all art ought to like say something, and as if art can't just be an object that's merely creating aesthetic pleasure. And I think this idea really rings a bell for me about the debate between like pure art, that is most valuable art, and that art should be admired just for its form instead of its content. And I think that was also like Clive Bell's aesthetic theory, like those people, the formalists. So the debate here is, would art just be valuable in virtue of its form instead of content? And the most exemplary of this idea would be like pure instrumental music. So I'm just wondering, what would Sontag's position be on this idea of whether art should have content or just be art in virtue of its form? And now it's really appropriate to lead on to her next essay, which is called On Style. And the core of her argument is saying that it's style rather than content which is central to a work of art. So art should be defined by its style of presentation or expression rather than what it says, because the latter can really be done just by like any statement of fact. So she sums it up by saying, indeed, practically all metaphors for style amount to placing matter on the inside, style on the outside. It would be more to the point to reverse the metaphor. The matter, the subject, is on the outside, the style is on the inside. And she also believes that the knowledge we gain through art is an experience of the form or style of knowing something, rather than a knowledge of something like a fact or moral judgment in itself. The core of what makes art art and what makes it valuable is its way of presentation, rather than the content of its presentation. Sontag also advocates for this idea called like the ideal contemplation of art. So it's meant to be detached, restful, contemplative, emotionally free, beyond indignation and approval. So we should really move away from any sort of identification with the fictional world, its events or characters. And she says, even though at first glance or first experience we tend to very easily collapse into that sort of identification, the most ideal audience, observer, reader should attempt to move away from that. Next essay I'm going to discuss is called The Anthropologist as Hero. So basically what this essay talks about is a French anthropologist called Claude Lévi-Strauss. I hope I have not butchered his name. And what she does is present some of his views and discusses the unique perspective through which an anthropologist sees contemporary society. So in the beginning, she summarizes modern thought in this very interesting sentence. She says, modern thought is pledged to a kind of applied Hegelianism, seeking itself in its other. Europe seeks itself in the exotic, in Asia, in the Middle East, among pre-literate people, in a mythic America. A fatigued rationality seeks itself in the impersonal energies of sexual ecstasy or drugs. Consciousness seeks its meaning in unconsciousness. Humanistic problems seek their oblivion in scientific value neutrality and quantification. The other is experienced as a harsh purification of self. It's ultimately this tendency to seek yourself in the other which leads anthropologists to study a lot of like exotic and primitive societies. So Lévi-Strauss, he's talking about his experience as an anthropologist. He believes that when you dive into the very origins of humanity, you realize that all the superstructures you have on top, such as like institutions, religion, morals, etc., they're all superficial impositions. And thus you realize none of them are really like true. You can't really believe in any of them. However, believing in them is necessary for existence, so you conform. And what happens is that the intellect no longer estranges you because you see it as a functional part of this superstructure. And in a sense, you don't feel like you belong anywhere because every such superstructure is a rejection of our very origins in nature. So this is where like the anthropologist's sense of estrangement from all the structures in the world is derived from. So it's derived from his awareness that anthropology proves nothing about human nature except the need for order itself. There is no universal truth about the relations between, say, religion and social structure. There are only models showing the variability of one in relation to the other. Sontag also spends some time discussing Lévi-Strauss's distinction between hot and cold societies. So hot societies are driven by a continuous desire for progress, like the ones that we live in. Cold societies are the ones which he calls static, crystalline, and harmonious. And this sort of situation is mainly seen in primitive societies. However, he sees the latter as a sort of utopian ideal. The final essay in this collection, which I felt interesting enough to be worth a mention, is called Reflections on the Deputy. So it's basically Sontag's commentary on this play called The Deputy, and it's by German playwright, let me try not to butcher his name, Rolf Hochhuth, and it depicts basically the Eichmann trial. So she uses the dramatization of this historical trial to discuss the innate theatricality that she sees in all like public courtroom trials. So regarding this matter, she says, the trial is preeminently a theatrical form. In fact, the very first account in history of a trial comes from the drama. And as the trial is preeminently a theatrical form, the theatre is a courtroom. The classical form of the drama is always a contest between the protagonist and antagonist. The resolution of the play is the verdict on the action. All the great stage tragedies take this form of a trial of the protagonist, the peculiarity of the tragic form of judgment being that it is possible to lose the case, i.e. to be condemned, suffer, die, and somehow triumph nonetheless. So in particular, she says the purpose of the Eichmann trial is an occasion for attempting to make comprehensible the incomprehensible. And furthermore, the function of the trial was like that of the tragic drama, above and beyond judgment and punishment, catharsis. So rather than actually like trying to determine and impose an so-called like appropriate legal judgment on the atrocities of the Holocaust, which according to Hannah Arendt, a really famous political philosopher and historian on like the Holocaust and the Jewish matter, she says it's already beyond the scope of human understanding and verdict. So since it's so atrocious that no legal punishment can really be a suitable verdict or encompass it, what we want to do in the courtroom is that we are enacting a sort of theatrical act in order to allow people to attain a sort of cathartic release from such human tragedy, to understand it, to tame it, and to give it a sort of conclusion. So the essays that I have discussed in this video are like the ones that I picked out of her collection in this book, which are like the most accessible ones, because there are a lot of other ones where she talks about very specific works or very specific artists, and a lot of them are like really niche topics, very avant-garde in that. So it's really hard to be accessible to everyone if you're not familiar with the topic. So this is why I only picked those essays for discussion. I think her writing is really provocative and it carries a strong sense of relevance in the 20th century, especially dealing with the art scene. So definitely worth a read. Lastly, if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.